Hello friends and greetings for the day. Welcome back to another tutorial on ISTQB Foundation Certification. We are in chapter 1 talking about the fundamentals of testing and looking forward to continue with our next segment, that is testing activities, testware and test roles. This segment is going to be pretty long, so we just don't want to put it in one tutorial, so you can expect part 1 and part 2 of this segment. So today we shall be covering the first part of it, which is test activities, and then we'll look forward to cover the remaining two in the next tutorial. To get started, of course, the very first topic we are talking about is the testing activities, which indeed, in other words, are referred to as our test process. All we are trying to understand from this segment is what are the major phases of testing lifecycle and what kind of activities are performed in their respective phases. Being a tester, I should be aware of what exactly these phases are, where is my contribution and involvement, and what kind of outputs I should derive from each particular phase. That means as and when a phase is completed, as and when these activities are being performed, what are our deliverables or what kind of work products we should be preparing and delivering to the next phase. Of course, with one of our principles, we understood that testing is context dependent, which means that two different applications are not tested. Indeed, for each and every application, we have a unique approach defined for it. So it is very, very crucial to understand that what are those contexts, what are those factors which influence, and of course, a test process will not remain same across organizations. So you must always dig out and understand more about that, what your organization's factors are which are influencing your test process. And ISTQB wants very much to be clear at this point of time that, hey, as this certification will be taken by different people from different organizations, your test process may vary slightly here and there than what we are talking about. And that's where they're just keeping it as general as possible, as simple as possible, so that you can easily digest the information without contradictions. So of course, testing is context dependent, but at a high level, there are common set of test activities without which testing is less likely to achieve the required test objectives. Also, these set of test activities basically form the test process, and the test process will be tailored to given situations based on the various factors which test activities are included in the test process, how they are implemented, and then when they occur is normally decided as a part of the test planning for a specific situation. That means most of your action items or determination of the test process and the respective activities will be done right at the planning phase, which is generally a key responsibility of the manager. So let's get into that generic process, what we are trying to convey you from here, and we will look forward to understand more about each of these phases. The very first phase is all about test planning, and as you see on the slide, we do not have much information about it right here in the chapter 1. That means the syllabus does not want you to concentrate on planning and monitoring and control at this point of time in chapter 1, but of course you will have a detailed explanation of the same in the chapter 5. That means we just don't want you to unnecessarily concentrate on something probably which we will not ask you a question about. So anyhow, just because we are watching this tutorial, so I should give you something more about the same. So however, I can give you a high level introduction to what is planning, but we will be deep diving into the same in the chapter 5 for sure. So test planning is basically a phase of the testing lifecycle where the journey of testing lifecycle kicks off. That means defining and determining all the set of activities what we will be performing in order to achieve the required goals of testing. So number one and most important thing is the very first we define the goal and objective of testing, that by conducting testing on a product, what is that are we trying to achieve? Right? You may have different scope of work at your own project, and those scope of work should be fulfilled or helped you to define the required objective which you should be considering as a goal of the testing entirely. At the same time, we also define the overall approach of testing. We define the timelines, resources, assigning those resources back to those respective tasks. For example, how many manual testers do we need? If there is a scope of automation, do we have automation testers with us? Then what is the amount of testing to be conducted? What is the tool going to be referred or used for this purpose, and so on. At the same time, we also look into definition of entry and exit criteria, the amount of documentation, the templates for it, and so on. On the same hand, if I talk about the monitoring and control, is basically a part of test planning itself. That means the determination of matrices or selecting of matrices for monitoring and control will be done right at the planning phase. But the reason why we consider this phase as an independent one is basically to let you know that it is a throughout activity. That means monitoring and control is not a one-time activity. It happens throughout the life cycle and will continue to take place till the test process gets over. Whereas monitoring is more about keeping an eye on ongoing progress of the project, which will help you to understand if your process is going as per the plan or getting deviated. In case it is getting deviated, the deviation will be observed by the help of matrices, and then an appropriate control action can be taken to overcome that deviation, where a control action can be defined as the corrective or guiding actions which helps you appropriately to curb the gap or the deviation which was observed. So a manager is generally responsible to determine all these what we just discussed, be a part of the planning and determine for the whole process. The next major phase which we get started with is the test analysis process, and as a part of the test analysis, the major objective is to start analyzing the test basis. Now hold on, that's the new word what you might be learning about. So test basis is a generic word or standard keyword used for any such documentation which testing team refers in order to derive test cases or test an application. So this just the reason I'm not using the word requirement here is because it is not limited to requirement. You can even refer architecture, you can even refer design, or you can talk about code, algorithms, workflow, use cases, business model diagrams, and whatnot. So as you have so many documentation which are referred for different levels of testing respectively, these documentations can be put together to be called as test basis. The word test basis means basis for testing. That means anything in your organization, what you might be calling it out as, is what you refer or start analyzing to understand the scope of work or the expectations of the product. At the same time, you also identify the testable features and you start to define and prioritize the associated test condition. Now, what exactly test condition stands here for? In our simple words, in our general life, we call them as test scenarios, but here we call them as test conditions. Okay, so test conditions are basically your scenarios which you start deriving from the requirement. Also, we talk about the test basis and the test objects are also evaluated to identify the defects. That means the static testing kicks off right from here. That means as you're going through the documentation, you're actually gaining understanding about the requirements and expectation, but at the same time, you're trying to understand more about the anomalies related to it. For example, if you go through a requirement and if you find an unclear requirement, ambiguous requirement, or inconsistent requirement, which means that unclear, incomplete, contradicting, you just let the author know. That means you are finding defects early right in the requirement. These defects are what result into a misunderstanding of requirement at a later point of time. Also, test analysis is often supported by the test technique, which simply means one thing that we can make use of test techniques to identify the required set of test conditions. However, they will be mainly used in the test design phase to derive the appropriate or minimum number of test cases. But when it comes to test scenario as well, we can very well go ahead and use certain techniques. So we will talk about these techniques in detail in chapter 4. Which will be completely about what are the techniques and how do we derive the minimum number of test cases. But right now, we just want to refer and let you know that as a part of analysis, we get started with all these determinations. So test analysis is that particular phase which basically answers that what to test. That means what exactly are the requirements, what exactly are the expectations, and what exactly we are supposed to test. And it uses in terms of a measurable coverage criteria. That means at the end of the day, these are the things what will be measured in order to declare that testing has been done or it is complete. Similarly, if I talk about the next phase, which is called as test design, and this phase is particularly about writing test cases and identifying other testwares or writing other testwares. Now, two new keywords, of course, test cases is very familiar to anyone who is in testing. So test cases are the set of instructions which help you to validate a particular functionality or feature, whereas testware is a generic word which is used for any other artifact or any other documentation which you create to support your test executions. For example, it could be a test data, test configuration, or any other documentation which you would need in order to run the test. And we put together, call it as testware, which also includes the environment in that. So this activity often involves the identification of coverage items, which serves as a guide to specify the test case inputs. Now, test techniques can very well be used to support the activity, that is to write the test cases. Also, test design includes defining the following activities, that is test data requirement, that what kind of data do you need to run the test, designing the environment, and identifying any other infrastructure and tool. That means the system configurations or DevOps or other tools or testing tools, etc., can be identified right here. Now, there is a key difference. You identify the tool here and implement or set up the environment in the next phase, which is implementation. So the words will help you: designing, implementing. So designing is all about identifying the environment and infrastructure and tools. Implementation is more about implementing the infrastructure, the environment, and the tools. Also, this particular phase is mainly triggered to answer the question that how to test, right? So in analysis, we understood this is all about what to test, and test design answers the question how to test. That means what exactly you would need in order to perform the test execution. The very next phase is all about the test implementation. As a part of test implementation, in single word, we can always say that it is all about getting ready for execution. That means all those preparatory activities, what you need to do in order to perform the execution, will be conducted here. Right from determination of the test procedure and automation scripts. Now, the test procedure is a new word for you again. Test procedure basically stands for the sequence of actions to be performed in order to run a test. Especially if I talk about automation testing, then test procedure basically helps us to determine that what configuration parameter, what kind of class calling structure, what kind of libraries, what kind of functions we should have in order to run the test. So sequence of action, that means when you trigger a test, I must have the data associated, I must have a environment declared, I must have a user profile associated, and so on, and then go to the script to run it. So the sequence of activities or actions which you perform in order to run a test is what you refer to as test procedure. So test procedures will be defined here. At the same time, we will also be responsible to write required test suites, which are basically the test suites are collection of test cases put together in an order to be executed together, right? So in most of the tools, these are also referred as test set. So test set is just the collection of test cases. Manual and automated test scripts are created. Now again, the details of the test script will be written here. And anyhow, if people are confused that how can automation script will be written here, because test cases are written in test design, then why not automation scripts are also written there? The reason is the test tools are implemented here, and you do not write an automation script in Notepad or Word document. You always write an automation script right in the automation testing tool. Also, all the test procedures will be prioritized at this point of time, and this will help us to have the items being sequenced in the order of execution. We'll consider all the factors which influence the priority of the test case execution, that is the complexity, the risk involved, the dependencies, and we put this into a table, and we call that table as test execution schedule. However, the test execution schedule will be understood in detail in chapter 5 once again, but right here we just want to give you an introduction that test execution schedule is prepared as a part of implementation. Also, we'll set up and verify that the environment is ready and we can go ahead and perform the execution. So these are some of the major activities what we get indulged in order to perform the test implementation phase. Well, talking about test execution, of course, it's very straightforward. At this particular phase, you start executing your test cases. In order to run the test, you will have everything with you because of test implementation phase. And right here, you start executing the test cases. As you execute the test cases, of course, you will map the actual with the expected. If in case your expected and actual are same, the test result is marked as pass. If in case they are different, it's marked as failed. As soon as the test is marked as fail, it is very important for you to report a defect by writing a defect report and start tracking that for the closure. As soon as the defect gets closed, of course, you will perform the repeating activities like retesting and regression, which we will talk in more detail about it in chapter 2. Also, many times it happens that people quite get confused in terms of like, hey, when it comes to analyzing the root causes or talking about fixing a defect, which phase does it happen in? Of course, all the defects will be reported during test execution, and at the same time, the developers will perform debugging or getting into the root cause and also providing the resolution of defects during this phase itself. Let me tell you, this is the only phase where all the major activities takes place. In fact, this is the longest running test phase altogether. So a tester is someone who has to be aware of that, the debugging, the root cause analysis and resolutions, and repeating activities like retesting and regression testing should all take place right. Last but not the least, of course, the test completion phase is the last and final phase of the test process, where it is also called as postmortem activities. And these activities are conducted once you have handed over the product to the business. That means at the end of test execution, you will be evaluating exit criteria to determine that you can stop testing or not. If in case you have stopped testing, you will hand over the product to the business, but post handover, you will still have something internally to take care of. For example, you will be writing a proper report documenting all those defects which remain open. Of course, we all agree that we don't close every single defect which we find. However, we try to close the maximum number of defects as per the contract. For example, if the contract says around 90% of defects should be closed or high priority ones must be closed, then we must close all of them. And the one which may have the margin of 10% can remain open, which you can close it later. However, we say that it is very important to close all the defects so that you don't see any unforeseen situation. But sometimes the time does not allow us to do that, or maybe there would be more amount of time required to fix them, so we do defer them for some time. Also, in this particular phase, we archive all the testware what we have used. That is mainly for the future reuse, or at least to hand over to the maintenance test team. The maintenance team is someone who is responsible to take care of the product after the release of the product to the market, and they take care of mainly things like update, upgrade, migration, and retirement. We'll be talking about that in more detail in chapter 2. So I'm introducing you to a lot of keywords here, but trust me, we will be talking about them in down the line. So right here, we will be archiving everything and storing them and even handing over for the future reuse. And we also sit together to gather the lessons learned related to all the activities we have performed. This helps us to improve over a period of time and do better process and better activities altogether. And last but not the least, of course, a test summary report will be prepared by the manager, which communicates all the overall activities, what you conducted in order to achieve the goal of testing, which you defined during the test planning. So a summary report will be populated and shared with all the requested or required stakeholders. Talking about the next topic, this is all about the stakeholders' need and expectations from the test process. So we are talking about the test process in context. And we say that testing is not performed in isolation. That means it is not a standalone activity as a part of SDLC. Test activities are an integral part of the development process carried out within an organization. Testing is also funded by stakeholders, and its final goal is to help fulfill the stakeholder and business needs. Therefore, the way the testing is carried out will depend on a number of contextual factors as listed here. So let's see who are our contributors and what other things are going to influence our entire test process altogether. Number one, the stakeholders. They will be contributing us from the needs, expectations, requirement, willingness to cooperate, etc. When it comes to team members, of course, they need to have the skills, required knowledge, level of experience, availability, and all sort of training needs, which we should fulfill in order to implement the work related to testing. When it comes to business domain, criticality of the test object, identified risk, market needs, specific legal regulations, etc. will be contributing here in order to drive our entire test process. Also, technical factors, which include the type of software, product architecture, technology used, will all be one of the contributing factors in terms of determining how my test process will actually be defined. So point being made is, if in case you're getting a little carried away that what these pointers are all about, we are talking about all those factors which influences the definition of your test process. As we told you that your test process may not be exactly the same to that of the other organizations, what are those factors which basically influence your test process? Also including project constraints, which means the scope, time, budget, resources, organizational factors like organizational structure, existing policies, practices used, etc. The software development lifecycle in use also is a contributor, because if you talk about the engineering practices, the development methods. Waterfall has a different approach altogether. Agile has a different approach altogether. So they do vary and determine the exact need of the test process. And also the tools. Given that we are talking about availability, usability, compliance, etc., the tools also drive our test process in a way that we can do it conveniently without any kind of obstructions. So these factors will have an impact on many test related issues, including the strategy, the technique used, the degree of test automation, required level of coverage, level of detail of documentation, reporting, etc. So put together, there are many such factors which determine what your test process will be all about and how will this help you to have the most efficient process to test your own product. So that's all for this particular part 1 and this particular tutorial team. Should you have anything else, feel free to comment below. I'm always there to address your queries and answer them well. Till then, keep learning, keep exploring, keep understanding the context. Thanks for watching the video team and happy learning.